It was a bright morning when Sarah walked into the most expensive luxury store in the city. The glass doors opened smoothly as she stepped inside, and the scent of fresh flowers and expensive perfume filled the air. Golden lights shined over the beautiful designer dresses, sparkling jewelry, and polished leather handbags. Everything in the store looked rich and perfect. Sarah, however, looked different from the usual customers. She wore simple clothes, an old brown coat, faded jeans, and shoes that had seen better days. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she carried a small, worn-out purse. Compared to the other customers in their expensive outfits, she looked out of place. Behind the counter, Mark, the store manager, noticed Sarah the moment she walked in. He was a tall man in a sharp black suit, with neatly combed hair and polished shoes. His eyes narrowed as he watched her. He had worked in this store for many years and believed he could recognize who was rich and who was not. To him, Sarah looked like someone who didn't belong there. Sarah walked towards the display of designer dresses, running her fingers gently over the soft fabric. She admired the beautiful work, the tiny details in the stitching, and the sparkling beads. Mark's lips curled into a smirk. "Excuse me, Mom," he said, walking towards her. "Are you lost?" Sarah turned to him and smiled politely. "No, I'm just looking." Mark crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "Looking?" He glanced at her worn-out clothes. "This is a luxury store. Nothing here is cheap." Sarah's smile didn't fade. "I know," she replied calmly. Mark sighed, clearly annoyed. "I don't think we have anything in your price range. Maybe you should try another store." His voice was cold and dismissive. Sarah's eyes remained steady. "I just want to look around." Mark let out a short laugh. "Listen, we don't allow people to waste time here. If you're not buying anything, you should leave." The other customers in the store started watching. A few whispered to each other, some laughing quietly. One woman in an elegant red dress shook her head in disapproval, as if Sarah's presence was ruining her shopping experience. Sarah's hands tightened around her purse, but her face showed no anger. "And what if I want to buy something?" she asked. Mark chuckled. "Oh, really? And what would you like to buy?" His voice was filled with sarcasm. He wanted to embarrass her even more. Sarah turned back to the dresses and pointed at a beautiful royal blue gown displayed on a mannequin. It was the most expensive dress in the store. "This one," she said simply. The store went silent for a moment. Then Mark burst into laughter. "That dress," he said, shaking his head, "that costs more than your rent." The other customers laughed too. Some shook their heads in amusement. Sarah didn't react. She kept her gaze steady. "Is that so?" she murmured, her voice calm. Mark smirked. He loved moments like this. "Yes, and we don't do window shopping here, so why don't you just?" Before he could finish, Sarah reached out and gently touched the dress. Mark immediately stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Don't touch it. You'll ruin the fabric with your dirty hands." The room went silent again. For the first time, Sarah's expression changed. Her eyes darkened slightly, but she still spoke softly. "Is that how you treat all your customers?" Mark rolled his eyes. "We treat real customers with respect." Sarah let out a small sigh, then nodded. "I see." She turned away from the dress and looked straight at Mark. "What if I told you I am a real customer?" Mark snorted. "Then I'd say you're dreaming." Sarah held his gaze for a moment, then smiled. But there was something in her smile, something unreadable. Mark didn't notice. He was already turning back to the other customers, ready to ignore Sarah completely. But he had no idea what was about to happen next. The air inside the store was heavy with tension. The customers had gone back to their shopping, but a few still glanced at Sarah, whispering and chuckling at her expense. Mark stood with his arms crossed, feeling victorious. He had done his job, keeping the store's reputation clean by removing people who didn't belong. But Sarah didn't leave. She took a slow step forward and looked at the royal blue dress again. The silky fabric shimmered under the golden lights. With a calm voice, she spoke. "I want to buy this dress." Mark blinked. Then he burst into laughter. "You," he scoffed. "Do you even know how much this costs?" Sarah nodded. "Yes." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "Lady, this dress is worth more than a year's salary for people like you. You can't just walk in and pretend to be rich." The other customers laughed again. A well-dressed woman in a pearl necklace smirked. "People will do anything for attention these days," she whispered to her friend. Sarah, however, didn't react to their comments. Instead, she pulled out a small black card from her bag and held it up. A platinum credit card. The laughter in the store stopped. Mark's smirk faded slightly. He looked at the card, then at Sarah's calm face. Something about this felt wrong. But he refused to believe it. "Nice trick," he said. "Just because you have a fancy-looking card doesn't mean there's money on it." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You think it's fake?" Mark rolled his eyes. "Of course. Do you expect me to believe that someone dressed like you can afford this dress?" Sarah sighed softly, then looked at the cashier. "Run the card," she said. The young cashier hesitated, looking between Sarah and Mark. Mark gave a cold laugh. "Fine. Let's end this joke." He snatched the card from Sarah's hand and walked to the register. With a smug smile, he swiped it. 1 second. 2 seconds. Approved. The register beeped loudly. The cashier's eyes widened. The screen showed a balance far greater than the cost of the dress. It wasn't just approved. This card belonged to someone incredibly wealthy. Mark's smile disappeared. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the screen. "This can't be real." Sarah took a step forward. "Now, will you still tell me that I don't belong here?" she asked softly. Mark swallowed. He could feel the eyes of the customers watching him. The room was now completely silent. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He forced a laugh, trying to regain control of the situation. "Well, anyone can have a credit card. Maybe you stole it." Gasps filled the store. Sarah's expression didn't change. She tilted her head slightly, studying Mark as if he were a puzzle she was trying to solve. Then she did something no one expected. She turned to the cashier. "Double the price of the dress," she said. Mark's eyes widened. "What?" Sarah looked back at him. "If I stole this card, the transaction won't go through. Right?" Mark clenched his fists. He had no way out. The cashier hesitated, then followed Sarah's request. She typed in the new amount and swiped the card again. The register beeped. Approved. This time, even the customers gasped. Mark felt his stomach drop. His confidence was cracking. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Would you like me to triple it?" she whispered. Mark took a step back. Something was very, very wrong. Who was this woman? And why did she seem completely in control? The entire store was silent. No one dared to speak. The cash register had beeped twice. 2 successful transactions for an amount that most people in the room could never afford in their lifetime. Mark felt his heart pounding in his chest. His palms were sweaty. He had humiliated this woman, mocked her, insulted her, and yet she had more money than anyone he had ever met. But his pride wouldn't let him lose. Not yet. With a nervous chuckle, he straightened his suit and tried to act unfazed. "Fine," he said. "You paid. Enjoy your dress." His voice was still arrogant, but there was a slight tremble in it. Sarah tilted her head slightly. "That's it." Mark frowned. "What else do you want?" Sarah took a slow step closer. "An apology." Mark scoffed. "For what?" Sarah's expression remained calm, but her eyes held something unreadable. "For judging me. For embarrassing me in front of everyone. For assuming I was worthless." Mark clenched his jaw. He could feel the stares of the customers burning into him. Some of them who had laughed at Sarah earlier now looked embarrassed themselves. The atmosphere had shifted. But Mark wasn't the kind of man to apologize. Instead, he smirked. "Look, lady, I don't have time for this. You got what you wanted. Now, if you don't mind, I have real customers to take care of." Gasps filled the room. A woman near the jewelry section whispered, "Is he insane?" Sarah let out a soft sigh and shook her head. "I was hoping you'd be smarter than this." Mark frowned. "Excuse me." Sarah gave him a long, hard look. "I'll give you one last chance to do the right thing." Mark rolled his eyes. "Oh, please, what are you going to do? Leave a bad review." He laughed mockingly. "Go ahead. I don't care." Sarah simply smiled. But this time, there was something different about it. Something dangerous. She picked up the receipt from the counter and tucked it into her purse. Then she turned toward the exit, walking at a slow, steady pace. Just before she reached the door, she stopped. Without turning around, she said 5 simple words. "You'll regret this very soon." A chill ran down Mark's spine. For the first time that day, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. But he pushed the feeling away, forcing another smirk onto his face. "Yeah, sure. You have a nice day, ma'am." His voice dripped with sarcasm. Sarah didn't respond. She simply walked out of the store. As soon as she was gone, the customers started whispering. Some shook their heads at Mark's behavior. Others looked toward the door, wondering who Sarah really was. The young cashier, who had remained silent the entire time, finally spoke. "Sir, I think you made a mistake." Mark scoffed. "Oh, please. She's just some rich woman looking for attention." But deep inside, something told him he was very, very wrong. And soon, he would find out just how wrong he was. The rest of the day felt strangely unsettling for Mark. Even after Sarah had left, her words echoed in his mind. "You'll regret this very soon." He kept telling himself that she was just another rich woman with a bruised ego, nothing more. But deep inside, there was a nagging feeling, a quiet voice warning him that something was about to go very, very wrong. He tried to shake it off, busying himself with customers and making sure everything in the store ran smoothly. But every time he passed by the register and saw the receipt from Sarah's purchase, a strange uneasiness crawled up his spine. Something about the way she carried herself, the confidence in her voice, the calmness in her smile. It wasn't normal. She wasn't just some random customer. And then, just as the store was about to close, his worst nightmare began. The main doors swung open, and 2 sharply dressed men in black suits walked in. Their presence was commanding, their movements precise, their expressions unreadable. They didn't look around, didn't browse, didn't hesitate. They walked straight toward him. Mark immediately tensed. These weren't regular customers. They looked like bodyguards. Important people always had bodyguards. His stomach twisted as one of the men pulled out a sleek black envelope and handed it to him. Mark hesitated before taking it, his fingers slightly trembling. The customers who were still in the store paused to watch, sensing that something serious was happening. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry as he slowly opened the envelope and pulled out a single piece of paper. His eyes scanned the words, and suddenly, the air around him seemed to vanish. His body turned cold. His hands shook. His mind refused to believe what he was reading. It was an official ownership document. The name at the top was not the name of his boss. It was someone else. Someone he had just humiliated. Sarah Kingston, new owner of the luxury store. A heavy silence filled the store. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The woman he had mocked, insulted, and thrown out was not just wealthy. She was now his employer. The person who had the power to decide his future, his job, his entire career. He felt his knees go weak, but he forced himself to stand straight, hoping no one would see the fear in his eyes. The man in the suit finally spoke, his voice deep and firm. "Miss Kingston has requested your immediate presence at her office. You are expected in 1 hour. Don't be late." And with that, the men turned and walked out, leaving behind an atmosphere so tense that no one in the store dared to move. Mark's heart pounded against his chest. His mind raced. He wanted to run, to escape, to take back everything he had said to Sarah. But it was too late. The mistake had already been made. And now he was about to face the consequences. Mark sat in his office, his hands gripping the edges of his desk as panic set in. His breathing was uneven, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. He had always been in control, always the one with power in the store. He decided who deserved respect and who didn't. But now, the tables had turned, and he was the one at the mercy of someone else, someone he had completely underestimated. He could still hear the quiet murmurs from the store floor as customers and employees whispered about what had just happened. They all knew. They had all seen it. He was no longer the arrogant manager who controlled the store. He was just a man who had insulted the new owner in front of everyone. His fingers trembled slightly as he checked the time. Less than 30 minutes until he had to face Sarah. What was he supposed to say? How was he supposed to fix this? Apologize? Beg? Would it even matter? He had gone too far. He had humiliated her, laughed at her, called her a liar. And yet, she hadn't reacted with anger. She had simply smiled. That smile terrified him more than anything. It wasn't the expression of someone who had been wronged. It was the expression of someone who knew she had already won. As the minutes ticked by, Mark forced himself to stand up, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. He couldn't let her see him like this. He needed to regain some control, to act professional, to make her believe that his insults were just misunderstandings, nothing personal. He grabbed his coat and stepped out of his office, walking through the store where employees quickly looked away, pretending to be busy. They were waiting for what would happen next. They knew that whatever Sarah Kingston had planned for him, it wasn't going to be good. Mark pushed through the glass doors and got into a taxi, barely able to focus as the car weaved through the city. When he arrived at the towering glass building that held the company's main office, his stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't just about a store anymore. Sarah wasn't just rich. She was powerful. People like her didn't waste time on revenge unless they wanted to make an example out of someone. And Mark had given her every reason to do exactly that. He stepped into the sleek, modern lobby, feeling completely out of place for the first time in his life. The receptionist barely looked at him before nodding toward the elevator. She had clearly been expecting him. As he rode up in silence, the cold metal walls of the elevator seemed to close in on him. He had always looked down on people like Sarah, assuming their worth based on appearance alone. But now, standing on the edge of an uncertain future, he realized just how wrong he had been. When the elevator doors opened, he was led into a massive office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. And there she was, sitting behind a sleek black desk, her expression calm, unreadable. She didn't look like the woman he had mocked in the store. She looked like someone in complete control. Mark swallowed hard, stepping forward, feeling smaller than ever. Then Sarah finally spoke, her voice quiet yet firm. "So, Mark, let's talk about respect." Mark felt an invisible weight press down on his chest as he stood before Sarah. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere behind her desk. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look amused. She just sat there, watching him, as if waiting to see how he would react now that he knew the truth. Mark cleared his throat, trying to regain whatever dignity he had left. "Miss Kingston," he started, but she raised a hand, cutting him off effortlessly. "Let's start with something simple," she said, leaning forward slightly. "Do you remember what you said to me in the store?" Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it, like a hidden blade. Mark swallowed. His mind scrambled to find the right words, but nothing felt right. Of course, he remembered. Every word, every insult, every mocking laugh. It was all burned into his memory. And now, standing here, it felt like each of those words had built the walls of his own prison. "Miss Kingston, I was just doing my job," he said quickly, forcing a nervous smile. "I misunderstood the situation. And you assumed," she interrupted. You didn't misunderstand. You assumed. You looked at me and decided I wasn't worth your respect. Mark opened his mouth to argue, but he couldn't. Because she was right. That's exactly what he had done. Sarah leaned back in her chair, tilting her head slightly as if studying him like a puzzle she was solving piece by piece. Tell me, Mark, if I weren't the owner, if I were just some regular woman who happened to have money, would you still be treating me this way? Would you have apologized? Or would you have gone home and laughed about it, never thinking of me again? Mark's throat felt dry. His usual confidence, his quick comebacks, his ability to control the conversation, they were gone. Sarah was in charge now, and he knew it. He started, but he had no answer. Sarah sighed and stood up, walking slowly toward the massive windows that overlooked the city. You see, Mark, I don't need an apology. I don't need you to explain yourself. I already know exactly who you are. She turned to face him again, her expression unreadable. But I want to teach you something. Mark's heart pounded. Teach me, he echoed, unsure if he liked where this was going. Sarah walked back to her desk, picking up a file and flipping through it as if checking something. You've worked at that store for 6 years, correct? Yes, Mark answered quickly, desperate to prove his value. I've helped build that place. I've kept the brand's reputation strong. You've made people feel small, Sarah interrupted, setting the file down. You've used your position to judge others. You decided who deserved respect and who didn't, based on their appearance. And you enjoyed it, didn't you? Mark felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to argue. But what could he say? That it wasn't true. That he had never felt powerful turning people away. The truth was, he had. And now, it was coming back to him like a storm he couldn't escape. Sarah exhaled softly, almost as if she felt sorry for him. Here's what's going to happen, Mark, she said. You're not fired. Yet. His eyes widened in shock. He had expected her to throw him out immediately. I'm not. No. She gave him a small, knowing smile. But you are getting a promotion. Mark's jaw nearly dropped. A promotion. He repeated in disbelief. This had to be a trick. Some kind of mind game. I don't understand. Sarah's eyes gleamed with something almost mischievous. Oh, you will, she said. Starting tomorrow, you will no longer be the store manager. Instead, you will work as a sales associate, and not in the back office, but on the floor, face to face with every customer. Mark felt his stomach twist. You're demoting me, he said, his voice tight. No, Sarah corrected. I'm promoting you to experience what it's like on the other side. His face paled. He had spent years commanding respect from behind a desk, controlling who was allowed to feel important in that store. And now, he was being forced to be one of the very people he had looked down on. Sarah smiled again. But this time, there was something almost victorious about it. Let's see how you handle being treated the way you treat others. Mark felt the air leave his lungs as Sarah's words sank in. He had expected anger, expected to be thrown out of the building in disgrace, maybe even blacklisted from ever working in luxury retail again. But this was worse. She wasn't firing him. She was making him live through his own mistakes. Every customer he had sneered at, every person he had judged, every insult he had casually thrown at someone he deemed unworthy. He was now going to be in their position. He would stand on the floor, no longer the powerful manager giving orders, but a simple sales associate, vulnerable to the same judgment he had once dished out without a second thought. His pride screamed at him to protest, to argue, to refuse, but deep down, he knew he had no choice. Sarah wasn't asking. She was deciding, and she held all the power now. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Miss Kingston, He struggled to find the right words, something that would make her change her mind, something that would save him from the humiliation that was coming. But Sarah wasn't interested in excuses. She picked up a pen, signed a document in front of her, and slid it across the desk toward him. "Your new contract," she said simply. "Same pay, same benefits, new position." Mark stared at the paper as if it were a prison sentence. His hands twitched, but he didn't pick it up. His mind raced. Could he walk away? Could he find another job? No, his reputation was tied to this store. If he left in disgrace, everyone in the industry would hear about it. This wasn't just about pride. It was survival. Sarah watched him in silence for a moment, then leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. "You think this is unfair?" she asked, reading his mind. "That I'm punishing you?" Mark opened his mouth, but she didn't let him speak. "I'm giving you a second chance," she said, her voice softer now. "Something you never gave others." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent years deciding who was worthy and who wasn't, never once thinking about how it felt to be on the other side. And now he was about to learn. Slowly, with a shaking hand, he picked up the pen. He hesitated for just a second, then signed his name on the paper. Sarah gave a small, satisfied nod. "You start tomorrow morning," she said. "Don't be late." Mark exhaled shakily and stood up, his legs feeling weak. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. He turned toward the door, his heart pounding, but just as he reached for the handle, Sarah spoke again. "Oh, and Mark." He froze, glancing back over his shoulder. Sarah's expression was unreadable. "Respect isn't about wealth or power. It's about character." Mark swallowed hard, nodded stiffly, and walked out. As he stepped into the elevator, the doors closing in front of him, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a lesson. This was going to change him, whether he was ready for it or not.